Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Pitman. I'm the Chief of Laryngology at Columbia University Medical Center, and I'm here today to talk about spasmodic dysphonia and the communication participation item bank. A lot of people with spasmodic dysphonia will know, especially the group that we're talking to today, that there aren't very good outcome measures that measure how much spasmodic dysphonia actually impacts your ability to communicate and function in your daily life, okay? And that's a major problem because when we're doing, for instance, Botox injections, I'll give an injection and a patient then comes back 3 months later, and the best way we measure it is by saying, how did you do? How was it? And they say, well, it was pretty good. Maybe we'll do a little more, maybe a little less. It's very nebulous. And I wanted a better way of measuring how people actually did so that we could tweak the dosage to get them really the best outcome possible. And the only way to do that is to really have a measured outcome each time and compare it over time. The second stimulus was we're working on a novel therapy for spasmodic dysphonia. And one of the really big problems in getting the industry backers of this to do the research was that they were afraid that it would never be adopted by, say, the FDA or insurance companies if we had no real objective way to show that patients got better with a novel therapy. And they were looking for a better measure, right? Because again, most of the traditional measures that we use are not very good. And so I went and searched for that better measure for two reasons. One was to help treat our patients better now and help pave the way to smooth innovation and bringing new therapies into the treatment realm and to get those therapies, to get the funds to be able to research those therapies. In terms of discovering the CPIB, I was working with David Francis, who's an expert in outcome measures, and he introduced me to the CPIB and to Carolyn Baylor. And once I learned more about it and how it was constructed, I realized that this would be an ideal measure for us in spasmodic dysphonia. Reasons why it's great is because it uses the most up-to-date psychometric tools and mathematic tools to create the most valid outcome. And it also, the creation of it was based on stakeholder interviews. So it was really not what the doctors or the nurses, the speech language pathologists thought was what bothered people. This was based on hundreds of stakeholder interviews, and we learned, what bothers the patient and what affects their quality of life. And then those were turned into the questions for the basis of the CPIB. And then they had hundreds of questions that they started with, and then using those mathematical tools, were able to actually figure out the questions that were most valid, questions that weren't redundant, and also very importantly, they found questions that will be able to chop up people's symptoms into those that are severe, moderate, and mild disease. So the questions are very important. They have to actually span the range of severity so that we can not just have a yes, something bothers me, and no, it doesn't. It's really targeted to figure out how can we narrowly define a patient's ability to communicate and give that a number. And so that, say, a 45 will be very different than a 50, okay, in terms of the T-score. And I think that's one of the biggest things that's different between the CPIB and the VHI-10. It's that the CPIB has been constructed so that you'll get a good broad range of results where you can really categorize people best by their severity of their disease, and then it'll be so sensitive when we sort of try to tweak the outcomes after treatment. You'll really be able to capture better small differences in improvement, and not only just in the middle of the scale, but also at the ends of the scale. And that we can't really do with the VHI-10 or the VHI in the same way. So that's why I wanted to pursue something like the CPIB, in addition to what has been out there previously. You know, there are about 220 other scales that are out there. They've been looked at. We talk about that in our presentation. None of them are specific or validated for spasmodic dysphonia. For instance, the VHI wanted to be a very broad scale, so they had people with lots of different types of voice disorders. Only 2 patients had spasmodic dysphonia. It's an excellent measure that has been accepted for the general use of voice disorders, but it is not specific for spasmodic dysphonia. And again, it doesn't have that broad range in the ability to discern small differences across the whole scale, because it wasn't created in the same way. And it also doesn't have the same, they did do stakeholder interviews, but it wasn't done quite the same way that the CPIB was done in creating it. So the VHI-10 is a good scale, and there's some relative similarities in the outcomes, as we showed again in our research, because we did show that you can see change with the VHI-10 before and after Botox as well. It's just not as good as the CPIB. Each question, it's 10 questions, each question begins with, does your condition interfere with? So it's more about how it impacts your ability to communicate, and that strain is going to be picked up in there. So you're not specifically asking about the strain itself, but if you're a lot of strain, then it makes it difficult for, so I have some questions up here that we asked. So does your condition interfere with getting your turn in a fast-moving conversation? Okay. If you have a lot of strain and difficulty getting out the words, that's going to certainly, you're going to say, you know, very much so, right? And so you'll be able to answer those questions. So it's not about each specific symptom that people have, but how the disease as a whole impacts your ability or interferes more specifically in your ability to communicate in different scenarios. One thing that's important about the CPIB in terms of the way you were saying, you know, spasms and strain and breaks and, you know, hoarseness. So we're not measuring those things per se. Again, what's really, I think, the most important, and what we learned from the patients when Dr. Baylor was screening them, when she created this, is that it's their ability to communicate, because communication is you know, showing someone that you love them, showing someone that you're angry at them, convincing a business partner to do something, or convincing you know, someone that you're having a negotiation with, or just buying something in a store, right? We do that. All we do all day is communicate. And so I think that's why it's so important, because getting at the sense of your ability to function in the world with others. So it does capture everything that is happening in the voice, but more of how that's, again, interfering with your ability to communicate. The short form is 10 questions, and it can be administered on paper. And you will check off if it bothers you not at all, a little, quite a bit, or very much. And then you'll get a raw score, and then that is actually translated into a T-score. And that's really important to not use the raw score, because the T-score takes into account all of the psychometrics and mathematics behind the CPIB, and then uses that to convert it into the T-score. Okay, so it's not a straight conversion. I'm sorry, it's not the absolute number. It's actually a conversion, and that's one of the ways that they can make it much more precise in its ability to grade the interference in communication of a disorder, and also that improvement. So you can take it on paper, but you do need to translate it with the tool into a T-score. There's also a website that you can go to, which maybe we can put up for the audience, but it's on the last slide of our presentation as well. And on there you can take it. That's a pretty cool website, because they actually use computer adaptive testing. So the computer is a smart computer, and you don't actually have to answer all of the questions. It actually, depending on how you answer, you may only answer 1 or 2 questions before you get a score, or 4 or 5 before you get a score, because it only gives you another question depending on where you fall with your original answers. And with that, you'll get a T-score generated as well. For me, clinically, what I plan to do is have patients, fill out their CPIB in the middle of their injection cycle each time and see how they're doing. So they don't have to do it by, remembering, oh, okay, how was my voice 6 weeks ago? They'll just fill it out. And when they come in, they have their score. And we can compare that to the previous scores and then decide, are the results of the Botox injection stable? Can we do better? Push the envelope a little bit in terms of dosing and muscles or regions that we're injecting to try and get the best scores possible. I don't think there's a utility in doing it every day. It's more of a gestalt of how you're doing in general. And so it's more of how, what the last 2 weeks essentially is the way the score really works. So no utility to do it in the morning when you get up to see how the rest of your day is going to go. So there's a lot of research that's necessary to truly show us something valid, and you have to have a mathematical and statistical result that shows you that. You can't sense that something's better or not, right? And you also, in something specific like the CPIB or something that's more modern, you have to make sure that every single one of the questions that's asked is also valid, right? And this is beyond my expertise. This is really, expert statisticians, and that's why we worked with Carolyn Bell and her team so they could run this. But we, had to have a certain number of patients to have the statistical power to show that this actually was valid for spasmodic dystonia. We had to get close to 200. We had 196, I believe, and I think we had 194 that we could actually use, right? And so that was why it was valid. But if we only had 50 patients or 100 patients, we wouldn't have enough statistical power to prove, because there would be some, aberrations or that could occur in the data because you didn't have enough people to average that out, right? And we did find that most of the questions in the CPIB were reliable for spasmodic dystonia. There were 2 that weren't, but that was not enough to make a difference because it was outweighed by all the other ones. So we didn't have to redo all the questions in the scales for spasmodic dystonia, and that's how we realized, okay, it's still valid. These questions are still valid for spasmodic dystonia, even though in just a few it wasn't, right? So that's one of the reasons to show that's why you need to mathematically show that it's valid, right? And that's the way that you do it. In addition, you have to show that it can actually that the scores from the CPIB are sensitive enough that they can detect a difference in the interference of your ability to communicate before and after treatment, right? So that, again, takes a lot of patience, right? Because, what if you have 5 patients and 3 of them, you can detect the difference, and 2, you can't detect the difference? Well, is that just because, the 2 you can't detect the difference have such severe SD, or there's a million reasons why you might see that? But if you have 190 patients, those small aberrations will get averaged out, right? So that's part of what the power is about. And so, again, we did the second stage to again, statistically validate that the CPIB can, within reason, mathematical reason, show a difference, effectively show a difference before and after treatment. This has been validated also for head and neck cancer patients, and for patients with ALS, and for patients with Parkinson's disease. And that was one of the reasons why I thought, we should do this. It's going to be great for spasmodic dystonia, because those aren't even really communicative diseases, right? It will not diagnose it, but it will tell you what the impact is on your communication. So we wanted to do this, and we're looking at the CPIB, and we wanted to validate for spasmodic dysphonia. And this is not an inexpensive thing to do. We have 200 patients, 3 universities collecting patients, a 4th university processing all the data. We use the REDCap database, and so there's no way we could have ever done it without the support of the NSDA and Cure Dystonia Now. And I think it really was super important to do it, because until it's validated, it does not stand up to scrutiny, especially for things like the FDA, right, or insurance companies, right, or even just getting people to accept it as a outcome measure clinically or in research, right? Because now it's validated. So when you use this in research, you know that this tool, the results of the tool, are accurate and there aren't these statistical aberrations, right? So that's one of the reasons why we think this is going to be accepted or adopted, I should say, relatively quickly in the research and clinical spheres, because it was validated. If I just took the piece of paper and said, oh, it's been, it looks like it's pretty good in ALS and Parkinson's, we should just use it, you never really know if it is good, because as we know, people with spasmodic dysphonia have different communicative issues than other patients, right? And so because we were able to actually validate this, we know now, and for the ongoing future, that this scale is specific and accurate in grading the impact of spasmodic dysphonia on a patient's ability to communicate, right? And we know going forward that we can use this to show new tools and novel therapies, whether they actually work, and modify that impact. And we're certainly going to use it in our studies for laryngeal stimulation. So I think it's going to take off pretty quickly. First, probably in the research side, but I don't see any reason why we can't use it also on the treatment side pretty soon. I mean, there are going to be a lot of patients who are getting really good results with their Botox, and they're happy with the way they are. So I don't know if it's going to impact them so much, but certainly in the new patients and people who are maybe wish, maybe I could get a little bit better. I think it'll help. And also there are some patients who have a difficulty communicating with their doctor. How good is your voice? Can it be better? Can it not? There's some people you can't get a great handle on. And so it'll be helpful for those people to do it also clinically. So I think there's going to be utility in the clinical sphere and the research sphere, and I think it's going to be picked up relatively quickly. So our next steps are to really just roll this out clinically and see what the utility is and how we can roll it out in a very efficient manner, like you asked before. We're going to do it on paper. We have people coming in now with iPads that they're checking in instead, and so it'll automatically file up. Maybe what we'll do instead, because we now have this capabilities, is just for every person who's been injected, just they get an email 6 weeks later and they get their score, and that goes into their chart. And when I come in, now I have a real accurate assessment of how they were doing in the heart of their treatment cycle, right? So I think that's how I'm mostly going to start to use that, and then see, does that change the way that I am treating my patients, and how often is it going to really make a difference? That's one way. But for sure, absolutely, this is now being incorporated into all of our research for our laryngeal stimulator, and I think it's going to be incorporated into the research of a lot of the people that are speaking today on the panels, and a lot of the research that's out there, because they've already asked me about it. But I don't want to say until they actually do it, but they've all been looking forward to it. So I think everyone's going to very quickly adopt this as one of their outcome measures. I think the most important thing is that now we have something that's good for the community of patients with spasmodic dysphonia, right? And something that's going to allow us to hopefully move a little bit faster with a little bit more assurance that we're doing the right thing in terms of our current treatments and in terms of developing novel therapies. proving that they work, what works and what doesn't, because some of the things will work and some things won't. This will help us parse that out. Any treatment whatsoever, and all those novel treatments that we're hoping are coming in the pipeline also. We have done, we collected the pilot data on the electrical stimulator, or I should say electrical stimulation of the innervation of the larynx, and showed that it can make a difference in patients with spasmodic dystonia and improve their symptoms. So we had a proof of concept. And over the last year and a half, one of the things actually we've been working on was finding good outcome measures, objective measures that we could bring to the regulatory agencies to show whether or not, to prove that the stimulator actually had a beneficial effect. And it took a lot of time to do that, and there really aren't, again, great measures. And so the CPIB will be one of the primary ones. But it took us about a year and a half to go through that, and we looked at many different things, and really there wasn't much that was very successful. One thing we found is the maximum phonation time is decreased in patients with spasmodic dystonia, and there's also some pitch variation, but that's about it in terms of objective measures. So that's what we've been doing. And now that we've finished that, the research projects are set up with the right measures to see if there's benefit. And we were getting ready to start again with the next phase of actually, again, doing stimulation on patients in Europe. And unfortunately, we had the COVID epidemic, and that's put things on hold. For how long, we do not know, right? Because this is human research, which takes a lot of human interaction. I think we're going to be delayed many months until we get started again. But the good thing is that all the pieces are in place. So when the time comes, hopefully we can just flip the switch and resume the research again.